everyone, my name is Fonie Mitsopoulou, and I'm a history and politics student at Balliol College, Oxford, and one of the interview editors for the Oxford Political Review. We are extremely excited to have with us Professor Stephen Lukes. Professor Lukes was also an alum and previously a tutor at Balliol and is now at NYU. He is best known for his seminal work, Power, A Radical View, where he introduced his third dimension of power, which was both extremely contested as well as immensely influential. He has also written on a myriad of other topics, such as moral relativism, Émile Durkheim, and Marxism. So, hi, Professor Lukes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So I'd like to start off by talking, of course, about your work on power. PRV was quite theoretical. It doesn't necessarily take aim at specific groups very much. So are there any specific power centers you would identify potentially, like, economic, political, or military elite? Do you agree with, the C. Wright Mills typology?
The latest edition, there's just a new edition out right now, third edition, after 50 years. And there, the last chapter is called Exploring the Third Dimension. And in that chapter, I do actually go into some quite detailed discussion of very particular situations and power, as you put it, power centers. So I talk about one section of that last chapter is now about digital power. It's about power through the internet. And another section is about environmental degradation. Both of these very much contemporary issues. So on the first question about digital power, I talk about a very interesting recent book and influential book by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism. And that's really about the way in which she doesn't refer to my idea, but she invents something she calls instrumentarian power. And I take that up. I talk about the way in which power is at work in getting us to buy stuff and basically want things in ways which are not very visible, in fact, even invisible to us. Though how invisible they are is another question. But that sort of relates to a very general point about the book, which is that what's always interested me, and that's why I call it the third dimension, I guess, is power that's inaccessible or invisible or relatively invisible to both actors and observers. In other words, the power that's most difficult to get at if you're trying to study it and analyze its working. And so the way in which Shoshana Zuboff talks about this is to write about the way in which the advertisers and corporations shape our wants and needs. And that's an old idea, of course. That's not, as it were, a new thought, but the way it's done is new. And this is what she focuses on. The whole sphere of what she calls behavior modification. And that part of it is actually, I think, new. I mean, I didn't deal with that in Power Radical View earlier. In other words, the way in which the what's going on is not shaping beliefs and preferences, though that's partly at work, but actually, this is her argument, bypassing that very process by modifying our behavior in some way independently of our thoughts and desires. So, not to say any more about it, I could go on forever, but that there's a section anyway in the new book, in the new edition, about that, and I'm critical of her, partly of Shoshana Zuboff, partly because she is totally preoccupied pretty well. It's a very big book, long book, interesting, but she is really preoccupied with us as consumers and the way in which corporations get us to buy stuff. The end of the sovereign consumer, she thinks. Though I don't think the consumer's ever been sovereign under capitalism, but that's another story. But I focus, to some extent, I try to focus much more on, or in part, on politics, on the way in which power used in the digital way is actually influential. I mean, think about Cambridge Analytica and, you know, the influence of power in this way over voters, over not just think of Brexit and Trump, but all over the world. And Cambridge Analytica was at work everywhere. So anyway, that's one example. The other example is what I call environmental degradation, and there I focus on a very particular study, a wonderful book called Flammable, about an Argentinian shantytown, and about the way in which people are basically bamboozled by corporations into accepting, willingly submitting to their very, very oppressed condition of being poisoned in an Argentinian shantytown where they are basically being confused and distracted by power. So that's another aspect in which I think power is at work in very contemporary forms. That's a long answer to your question.
I mean, it's a fantastic answer. But it seems like in the first part of your answer, you kind of make this comparison between this rise in economic power and the more political power which you continue to focus on. Do you think that these are largely mutually exclusive? Do you think that one has grown particularly at the expense of the other? Are they potentially maybe sometimes the same thing?
Well, you referred in your first question to Wright Mills. I mean, I think we're living in capitalism after all, so obviously they're not disconnected. Well, they certainly are very closely interrelated. What's really interesting here, very particular point, what's really interesting here in America right now is the way in which corporations, capitalist corporations, are to some extent actually separating themselves from the political power sources in some ways, in response to what's happening among people. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of the ways in which corporations are actually responding to something like the Me Too movement in ways which, you know, embedded politicians don't really like. So I think we're seeing something interesting at work there. Not that it's kind of major yet, but so, you know, Wright Mills talked about the military-industrial complex. I mean, the military-industrial complex has to be more complex than that phrase suggests.
So a lot of these analyses focus a lot on the UK and the US, and I was wondering how generalizable they would be to other countries. Because, for example, the military-industrial complex would be quite relevant in the US, but maybe less so in other European countries, which have seen increasing demilitarization.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I use that phrase, military-industrial complex, with Wright Mills here, but we really should be talking about the political military-industrial complex. The military aspect of it, I think, well, that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's less sort of significant, at least internally in America, than it was when Wright Mills wrote. But, you know, obviously the interconnections and degrees of separation between these different spheres are different in different countries. You're obviously right. And in some countries, especially in Eastern Europe now, I mean, I'm thinking of Hungary and Poland, the political has become very primary.
So I wanted to ask about whether you think that with, you know, the democratization of political education through mass media, technology, mass communications, whether we're getting those being quote unquote dominated or having power exercised, you know, towards them, are they becoming increasingly aware and able to articulate power structures and where they can be located within these?
I know, that's really interesting. I discovered this when writing this third edition. I mean, because I discussed it a lot with my students at NYU, at New York University. And they, I'm thinking of one in particular, a woman student, was very persuasive in persuading me that young people, I mean, your age, this younger generations are very savvy. I mean, you know what's going on. I think I can remember back at the time. I mean, you talked about Wright Mills. I mean, he talked a lot about apathy and the idea basically was that people were being bamboozled a lot by the powers that be. I think that this is less and less true. I think you know what's going on. So that, for instance, this digital power thing. I mean, people, having their information being extracted from them, but actually voluntarily providing it. I mean, whenever you click on "I agree," you are basically giving all kinds of information about yourself to these corporations, which then use it in turn to affect your own behavior. And I began by thinking, well, that's a form of third dimensional power, which is in some way inaccessible to people. But I'm persuaded that you know what's going on and actually are complicit in it. I think your generation are not being bamboozled in the way in which people were in the past so much.
I was wondering whether potentially this increased knowledge of these kinds of subjects and the increased discussions of power could potentially have a negative side to them, in the sense that what might come to mind would be conspiracy theories, like the notion that there is this shadowy cabal which is acting behind the scenes to control what we want and how we think. Yeah. Have you encountered this idea at all?
Yes. I think that when you take the line I took, or go along the path I trod, namely to look at the ways in which power is at work in less visible ways, that immediately opens up the question, well, we all know that this happens, and then that leads many people, too many people, to think about, the deep state, conspiracy theories of all kinds. And that, of course, is a real danger. And that's why I think, and I've always tried to say this from the beginning, that the topic of power is empirically researchable and has to be. You have to find ways of finding evidence and making claims that are, if not verifiable, falsifiable in some way or other. That there has to be, it has to be controlled by evidence. And the tricky thing is to find out what sort of evidence is going to be persuasive. But I mean, I've often been attacked in my writings about power for making suppositions about what's going on that people aren't aware of. And so I talk in the book about people's real interests, and even use the phrase false consciousness. So I use that always in quotation marks because that's got a very bad history, that phrase. But when people say, "Oh, you're just attributing to people wants and desires that they don't have," you're saying that people are being manipulated or being controlled, and you're just doing it non-empirically. My response always is, do you really think that this doesn't happen? It seems to me to happen all over the place, and the trick is to figure out how to identify what's happening and not just indulging in speculation.
Okay, so let's talk about potentially your role. Do you think that intellectuals, in their positions of kind of shaping opinions and producing ideas and knowledge, do they act as exercisers of the third dimension of power?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, in other words, are we not ourselves in even thinking about these questions also influencing people in the three-dimensional ways? I mean, I do think that, and this was a mistake I think I made in the earlier versions of this book, in the earliest version, just to talk about domination as though power is always, in some way doing people in. It's always a form of domination. And of course, that can't be true. Power has to have positive effects, has to be positive. Benefit can even be beneficial. And I'm fully, I hope fully, I mean, I try to be completely aware of that and to take account of it. So to be specific, I mean, I think that what interests me is the ways in which power can be used to dominate people. That's to say, to get them to willingly comply. This is the third dimension. To willingly comply, to willingly submit to power that works against their interests, which of course raises all the questions, well, how do you know what they are? And I mean, that's the tangle you have to get into. And what I resist is the idea that we shouldn't discuss any of this because it's all too speculative, or, you know, there's nothing to say about it that isn't prejudiced. There's a real set of questions here. I mean, why did any number of people vote for Brexit? Just to be very specific. Now, you could be against Brexit or in favor of it. I'm actually, as you can guess, was very much and remain very much against it. But, of course, people had their reasons for it. But the idea that people were not misled and indeed didn't actually comply, that's to say, willingly take part in being misled, the idea that didn't happen seems to me absurd. It obviously did happen. And to some extent it was manipulative, and to some extent it wasn't. But it seems to me you have to raise this as a question and study it. And it's it doesn't satisfy me to say, oh, even to get into that is to be ideological, because I think it's a social scientific issue.
It kind of links to your work on, you know, moral relativism, where when you were writing and you were putting up the case in, you know, you were explaining the case in favor of it, where you're discussing, you know, with what authority are we to judge other cultures and to impose our standards? It kind of brings to mind like the kind of criticism that you received, which goes along the lines of, you know, to what authority can I turn around and tell, not you, the proverbial you, can I turn around and tell, you know, this individual whether or not what they're doing is in their best interests? Right. And, you know, considering that, it's also potentially you could identify like this dynamic in which when we talk about these people who don't know their real interests, it's usually, I assume, people like women or people, members of the working class, these kinds of people as well. So I wonder if, like, you know, from the outside, this can look a bit, you know, sorry?
Patronizing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the idea that to talk about people's real interests is presumptuous is very healthy. I mean, we should accept that it is in a way, and I think that the task is to try to make sense of this idea that people can not just be power can be exercised or can be at work in getting people to act against their interests. You've got to make sense of what that means, and figure out how to make sense of it that is not presumptuous and patronizing. Because what I resist is the idea that this can never happen. I mean, because it obviously does happen, but there has to be a way of talking about this which doesn't just involve me claiming that I know better what you want than you do. But sometimes I can figure that out. And the idea that people can never be subject to power in this way is something I also reject. I did want in that book to stress that nobody should just dismiss moral relativism as obviously absurd. I wanted to make the case for it, to make it seem as attractive as possible, just to actually reject it. I mean, in other words, I think nobody should just reject it without seeing what a powerfully attractive idea it is.
I definitely understand that this was meant to be something that was empowering rather than patronizing. And it was to give people like the tools to be able to understand and then, you know, oppose these power structures. I was just trying to point out that potentially it might look as though this kind of power structure would be replicated when you have like a very well accomplished male intellectual telling people, oh, this is what you actually want, you know. But no, I definitely understand where you're coming from, and I definitely understand that, of course, accountability also plays a role in all this, about understanding it, meaning that we're more able to keep people accountable. And I was wondering, on that topic of accountability, there's, of course, this wider debate between that took place when you first wrote PRV between voluntarism and structural determinism within Marxist theory. And I was wondering if you thought that there was anything to the case that sometimes it is structures rather than people who are creating this kind of power, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. That went on forever. That's a kind of structure versus agency dispute. And I'll just say one thing about that, and that began, first of all, there's a debate between Poulantzas and Miliband, and that sort of started it all off. And the thing is, I'd say one simple thing about that, which I don't know whether you'll find it satisfying, but I just think that can go on forever, that debate. And what I think is that it should. That's to say, I don't want to see it resolved, because there's no way of resolving it. It has to be kept alive. I mean, there has to be this idea that structure and agency are at work interdependently. And so neither side should win that argument. That's for one thing I don't want to say. What else did I want to say about that? I don't know. I think, yes, this is merely a linguistic point, but it's not only linguistic. Power. I think I want to keep power, the word, attached to agency. Because I think if we start saying that structures have power, we're kind of lost. I mean, they obviously have, structural determination is largely at work. I mean, Marx knew that very well when he said, talked about social relations being indispensable and independent of our wills, of course. And it's there in Durkheim. I mean, the idea of structural determination limiting possibilities for human choice is obvious. But I want to keep power, the word power, attached to agency, just because it just enables thought to proceed better, I think. You get dangers when power starts to become impersonal and unattached to agency. That happens with Foucault, I think. At least the Foucault who would say inflammatory things in interviews. And when you start saying, as Foucault did, power is everywhere at work in society, I think you've lost the sense that there's something here to study.
Yeah, it almost somewhat undermines what you're trying to do, which is trying to also, make us more aware of these people and trying to, help us keep them accountable, because it gives them a channel by which to be able to say, oh no, it's not me, it's the structures.
Right. Just one little complication to add to that, though. I do want, at one point you used the phrase exercising power, and that's perfectly reasonable. But I want to warn against that a bit, because in the book, I tried to say, actually, power isn't just a matter of intentional exercise. I mean, I think that power is often at work, and very importantly, in routine and unconsidered ways, so that we shouldn't just assume that power is always, so to speak, people deliberately doing stuff to other people.
I guess to tie up this wider conversation about power in specific, you mentioned Foucault, and in a previous interview, you have referred to his notion that power is everywhere and you can't escape it. You referred to it as a bit grim. Do you disagree with it?
Well, power is kind of everywhere in one sense. I mean, but he just makes it too diffuse. I mean, for him, it's detached, in other words, from agency. To go back to your earlier point, and it just becomes. And the thing I really don't like about Foucault is he makes a move which I do resist. Some people have said there are 4 dimensions of power, not 3, and I say, well, I'm not convinced yet. I think that and I talk about this in the 3rd edition. I think that everything that I think we should be saying about power can be said with 3 dimensions. The 4th dimension for Foucault involves power actually constituting people, constituting the very self of people, and that, I think, goes too far. That's an ultra radical view of power. Which is too radical for me. We have to retain the idea that there are people who are subject to and resist power. And of course, Foucault says that also, and indeed the latter part of Foucault's work is all about self-fashioning and the idea that there are selves who are engaged in fashioning themselves. So I think Foucault actually left that idea behind, and I think he was right to do so.
That's actually quite interesting. You answered one of my questions because I was wondering whether you thought there was potential for further development, for someone to come in after you and be like, oh, there's more to this actually, just like you came in after the people in the second dimension. Because it almost feels like there's just this kind of critical dialogue wherein the notion of power just develops the more aware of it we become.
Yeah. Well, there's a book by Mark Hogarth, who edits the Journal of Political Power. He's great, and it's called The Four Dimensions of Power. So he makes the case. Doesn't really convince me yet. I think I think a fourth dimension of power is. By the way, there's a trick here, which I should like to point out, which is rhetorical, and I just admit to it. I mean, I think one reason why people have read my book and been in some way convinced by it is because of the metaphor or the imagery of dimensions. I mean, this started off as being there's one face of power, there are two faces of power. Then I converted that into dimensions. And the trick is, who would want a one-dimensional view of something, or even a two-dimensional view? If you could have a three-dimensional view, you see further and deeper. So that I think sort of in terms of the language maybe persuades people a bit. I'm not sure about the fourth dimension. I don't know if you see more with the fourth dimension. I don't think you do. But maybe I don't know enough about dimensions.
I think that's really interesting. Well, I also wanted to discuss, I think, the discipline of sociology more specifically, actually more in general. I was wondering whether having experienced practicing both in the UK and in Oxford specific, but in the US as well, whether you found that there were quite a few differences across the Atlantic.
Oh, well, sociology in America is much more developed as a discipline, and there's a much richer history there. In Oxford, I mean, I can't speak so much about sociology in Britain now because I'm not that much au fait with it. But when I began, just to be autobiographical for a moment, when I began at PPE, reading PPE, and then becoming a graduate student, sociology didn't really exist in Oxford anyway. I mean, it existed in England, but not very, prominently. And so I had to learn sociology actually by going to London School of Economics to go to courses by Tom Bottomore. And so sociology grew in England, and there were some wonderful examples of it at work. I mean, there was empirical sociology, especially into stratification and class, Goldthorpe and Lockwood and all those people, and at Nuffield, where I was for a while. So sociology has some real strength in Britain, but it's a much richer field in America. And I think, but also I myself have been involved in European sociology because I was one of the editors of the European Journal of Sociology for over 40 years. So I think, in some way, to answer your question, I think of British sociology is rather thin, actually, compared with what exists elsewhere.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, like sociology has developed quite a bit, over the course of your own career. Since it is actually just quite new, I imagine it's changed quite a bit in recent history. And I was wondering whether you had anything to say about these kinds of developments, because, back when you wrote the first edition of Power, it was quite behavioralist and quantitative as a discipline. And I wonder if you feel like that's changed quite a bit, because that's not really your style, I would say.
But let's make it, let's think that it was political science that was so behaviorist. And that was what I was attacking in that book. So that PRV was actually it began as an argument within political science. And political science is totally, I mean, very much changed since then. Behaviorism isn't the paradigm. there's a very strong influence in political science, which is not what you were asking me about. But these days, that's very much influenced by rational choice theory and economics as a sort of model of how to do social science. At least it's very powerful in political science in my university, in New York University, for instance. But sociology is far more variegated field. It always has been. And so there are so many different ways of doing sociology, different traditions. And so one of the things I think, and I make this point in my lectures, I have been lecturing on doing sociological theory lectures in NYU for 20 years. And I always comment there on something, maybe this relates to your question, that is remarkable, that sociology, unlike any other social science, indeed unlike any other science, is preoccupied with its founders, with its past. And so certainly at NYU, but I think in lots of other places, students of sociology have to read Marx, Durkheim, Weber. In my case, I get them to read Simmel, but then, and then more recently, other people have been included, so that I include, for instance, W.E.B. Du Bois and Simone de Beauvoir, actually. So there's a range of different ideas of what sociology is and how to do it, and what it is to do sociology is itself in dispute among sociologists in a way that is not true, I think, anything like the same extent in other social sciences. There's no mainstream really in sociology as there is in economics, for instance. And so I think that sociology has a sort of inescapable past in a way in which other social sciences don't. I mean, no natural scientist has a special required course. I mean, has a required course studying Newton and Faraday and even Einstein. I mean, they're natural scientists all learn about the history of their discipline, incidentally in textbook summaries, whereas we sociologists are kind of endlessly going back into the variegated past of the discipline.
Well, that actually reminds me of an interview that you did with Isaiah Berlin a few decades ago, which I thought was endlessly fascinating. But he mentions about how he objects to people who study nothing but sociologists, how, you study Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, but in turn, they themselves had studied law and history and philosophy. And I was wondering if you felt as though sociology has to also involve the inclusion of other disciplines, or whether it is sufficient to just be studying, or whether you disagree with him and you think it's sufficient to just be studying these great sociologists and the history of sociology as a discipline itself.
I agree with him. And in fact, just to add what I was saying before, in my course in sociological theory at NYU, I always included Alexis de Tocqueville and Saint-Simon, who was a kind of predecessor, but is not usually thought of as a sociologist. No, I mean, absolutely. I think that Isaiah Berlin was right. Sociology is, after all, what it is. It's the study of the social. So how could this be confined? I mean, I think, in a way, that economists and political scientists, for instance, and psychologists, they don't have to bother so much about boundaries, maintaining and policing the boundaries of their disciplines. Maybe they should, but they don't have to. Whereas I think in sociology, there's no way. I mean, it's unlimited. What is sociology not in principle about? Sociologists have, in principle, the whole of the social to investigate, and there are no exclusions. Sociology is nothing is human. Nothing human is alien to me, I think should be a sociologist's motto.
Within the same interview, Berlin calls out E.H. Carr, for example, who is another Balliol politics tutor, for looking only at history and neglecting philosophy, saying that as a result, his views were crude and that he was unable to deal with concepts.
Ah.
Do you feel like philosophy itself plays a massive role within this wider field of sociology of politics?
Plays or should play? I mean, like you, I studied PPE. And from the start, I was influenced by the idea of PPE, namely interconnection. And I was very fortunate, actually, in my tutors at that time. One of them was Alan Montefiore, who was always interested in interconnections between philosophy and other sciences, including social science. But my first tutor in philosophy, lucky old me, was Charles Taylor, who taught me philosophy in my very first term in Oxford. And so, since that time, and also I had a wonderful economics tutor at Balliol called Paul Streeton, who was also very interested in the connection. He was very interested in the role of values in economics, and so right from the start, I was very interested in philosophy's relation to the practice of sociology, and I've kind of retained that all the way through, I think, and so. But when you said, does it have this role? I mean, I don't know how many actual practicing sociologists are particularly interested in philosophy. Probably not that many, but I think these interconnections are terribly important and have to be kept alive. And so there is a kind of area of research and thinking called philosophy of social science. And it's always been a bit of a poor relation, I think, among philosophers and even among philosophers of science. But I think it's really important. And there's some great work is done in that area, I think, has been and still is.
And I think there is like a big part of sociology, as we were talking about, albeit not the entirety of the field, which is quite preoccupied with not appearing as though that want to appear as though they are politically neutral.
The name that comes to my mind when thinking about these questions is Max Weber. So Max Weber, great sociologist, but also great historian, and a great everything actually, kind of polymath. He wrestled with this question, and he was completely clear that we bring to our work, for instance, as sociologists, a whole set of questions and assumptions and values, which is inevitable. How could we not? I mean, we're located in history at a particular time, and we have our own questions and values. That has to be true. But then there are procedures, there are and institutions too, which must constrain us when we do the work, such that we can aim at being, objective in the sense of getting things right and subjecting our assumptions, what we want to be the case, to the facts, to the evidence, and to arguments. So constraint upon value assumptions is the best we can do in social science, in my view. And that, so to use a phrase that a contemporary philosopher uses, Tom Nagel, the view from nowhere. Is there a view from nowhere? Well, no. For us human beings, no. But we can somehow think about that idea as a sort of beacon, as a way of dealing with prejudice, and try to be as open to evidence as is humanly possible.
Well, to end on a bit of a lighter note,
yeah.
I wanted to talk about the fact that you have also written a book, which is a collection of political jokes.
Yeah.
And I wanted to discuss a bit about the notion of using humor to approach topics that might be a bit heavy in politics, and like why this potentially would be a good approach.
That interest of mine was generated. I mean, it's always kind of been there, but I got very involved with Eastern Europe and what was going on in the Soviet Union, and so the role of political humor in oppressive regimes got to interest me a lot. and then it kind of coalesced when this Israeli friend arrived, and we decided that we shared these interests, and we did this book together, which was basically a kind of fieldwork, a sort of anthropological fieldwork, in which we went around collecting jokes, often at dinner parties. But the phenomenon of the joke was really interesting. It's a kind of flash of insight. There's a very interesting book by Arthur Koestler called The Art of Creation, or is it The Act of Creation? One or the other. And it's about comparing insight that you get in a joke with scientific intuition. The way in which humor is a way of grasping things in a very surprising way, or in a way which isn't conventional or isn't predictable. And I guess that's what intuition is. Something like that.
I mean, did you find that there were more of these kind of jokes of this nature in oppressive regimes?
Oh, yeah. Yes, actually. But that was also quite interesting, because there were differences. There were some countries we discovered which are very, very productive of political humor that was very powerful. That's to say, full of insight. For instance, Czechoslovakia, as it was then called, and Hungary. There was some remarkable, there's a whole literature about this, remarkable jokes from Nazi Germany. I mean, the more oppressive the regime, it didn't suppress the humor. Sometimes it just made it more and more painful and biting. But there's a lot of very interesting work on that. So you wanted to discuss something light. I think we're moving into a rather heavier area again.
You're right. Well, we'll end on a light note, I promise. But before that, I wanted to ask one final question that might be a bit more heavy. Which is, well, not really, but a bit, an oft-cited response to your analysis on power is that every time there is well, not the exercise as we have established, but every time there is power, that there's always opposition to it, either overt or, in any kind of form. And potentially this kind of like making jokes in these regimes was a small way of pushing back against a very, heavy-handed form of totalitarian power.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's a form of resistance. But of course also, which is something people have written about, jokes can get you into serious trouble. So they're resistance which the regime can use as a weapon. But also, I mean, it's a weapon against the regime, which the regime can then respond to. But also, the joking often takes part can actually be employed by the regime itself. In other words, I think it's fairly well known that some of the most powerful, interesting jokes in the Soviet Union were actually told by the members of the security apparatus. Mm. So, I mean, right at the heart of joking is ambivalence. So it's a weapon, but it can be used by both sides.
Well, to finish on the promised lighter note, do you have any favorite jokes or any particularly memorable ones that you could share with us?
Well, when I'm trying to think of what jokes stay with me, there's one in particular which I remember, it's in the book, about it's from Czechoslovakia, and it's about two members of the public two people are in an automobile exhibition, and they're looking at this car, and the car is a Rolls Royce, and one of them says to the other, "What an extraordinary example of Soviet technology." And the other one sort of looks at him in some amazement and says, "Well, what do you mean? I mean, you must know that that's a British car." And the first one says, "Yes, of course I do. But I don't know you. So that's a joke about trust.
That reminds me of another joke you included about the two politicians. And one of them said, "Oh, wow, I've heard so much about you." And the other one said, "Yeah, but you can't prove it."
Yeah, right. Well, that's a, yeah, I like the short ones. They're the best.
No, they're quite snappy. No, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Great. See you soon.